The Horse and His Boy, Chapter 11, The Unwelcome Fellow Traveller. When Shasta went through the gate, he found a slope of grass and a little heather running up before him to some trees. He had nothing to think about now and no plans to make. He had only to run, and that was quite enough. His limbs were shaking. He had a terrible stitch beginning in his side, and the sweat that kept dropping into his eyes blinded them and made them smart. He was unsteady on his feet too, and more than once he nearly turned his ankle on a loose stone. The trees were thicker now than they had yet been, and in the open spaces there was bracken. The sun had gone in without making it any cooler. It had become one of those hot grey days when there seemed to be twice as many flies as usual. Shasta's face was covered with them. He didn't even try to shake them off. He had too much else to do. Suddenly he heard a horn, not a great throbbing horn like the horns of Tashban, but a merry call. Toot-toot! Next moment he came out into a wide glade and found himself in a crowd of people. At least it looked like a crowd to him. In reality, there were about 15 or 20 of them, all gentlemen in green hunting dress, with their horses, some in the saddle and some standing by their horses' heads. In the centre, someone was holding the stirrup for a man to mount, and the man he was holding it for was the jolliest, fat, apple-cheeked, twinkling-eyed king you could imagine. As soon as Shasta came in sight, this king forgot all about mounting his horse. He spread out his arms to Shasta. His face lit up, and he cried out in a great, deep voice that seemed to come from the bottom of his chest, "Corin, my son! And on foot and in rags! What? No," panted Shasta, shaking his head. "Not Prince Corin. I know I'm like him. Saw his highness in Tashban. Sent his greetings." The king was staring at Shasta with an extraordinary expression on his face. "Are you King Loon?" gasped Shasta, and then, without waiting for an answer, "Lord King, fly, Anvard, shut the gates, enemies upon you, Rabadash and 200 horse." "Have you assurance of this boy?" asked one of the other gentlemen. "My own eyes," said Shasta. "I've seen them, raced them all the way from Tashban." "On foot?" said the gentleman, raising his eyebrows a little. "Horses, with the hermit," said Shasta. "Question him no more, Darin," said the King Loon. "I see truth in his face. We must ride for it, gentlemen. A spare horse there for the boy? You can ride fast, friend." For the answer, Shasta put his foot into the stirrup of the horse which he had been led towards, and a moment later he was in the saddle. He had done it 100 times with Bree in the last few weeks, and his mounting was very different now from what it had been on the first night when Bree said that he climbed up a horse as if he were climbing a haystack. He was pleased to hear the Lord Darin say to the king, "The boy has true horseman, sire. I'll warrant there's noble blood in him." "Ah, his blood, aye, here's the point," said the king, and he stared hard at Shasta again with that curious expression, almost a hungry expression in his steady grey eyes. But by now the whole party was moving off at a brisk canter. Shasta's seat was excellent, but he was sadly puzzled with what to do with his reins, for he had never touched the reins while he was on Bree's back. But he looked very carefully out of the corners of his eyes to see what the others were doing, as some of us have done at parties when we weren't quite sure which knife or fork we were meant to use. And he tried to get his fingers just right. But he didn't dare to try really directing the horse. He trusted it would follow the rest. The horse was, of course, an ordinary horse, not a talking horse, but it had quite its wits enough to realise that this strange boy on his back had no whip and no spurs, and was not really master of the situation. That was why Shasta soon found himself at the tail end of the procession. Even so, he was going pretty fast. There were no flies now, and the air in his face was delicious. He had got his breath back too, and his errand had succeeded for the first time since the arrival at Tashbaan. How long ago that seemed! He was beginning to enjoy himself. He looked up to see how much nearer the mountain tops had become. To his disappointment, he could not see them at all, only a vague greyness rolling down towards them. He had never been in mountain country before, and was surprised. "It's a cloud," he said to himself, "a cloud coming down. I see, up here in the hills, one is really in the sky. I shall see what the inside of a cloud is like. What fun! I've often wondered." Far away on his left and a little behind him the sun was setting. They had come to a rough kind of road by now. They were making very good speed, but Shasta's horse was still the last of the lot. Once or twice when the road made a bend, there was now a continuous forest on each side of it. He lost sight of the others for a second or two. Then they plunged into the fog, or else the fog rolled over them. The world became grey. Shasta had not realised how cold and wet inside of the cloud would be, nor how dark. The grey turned into black with an alarming speed. Someone at the head of the column winded the horn every now and then, and each time the sound came from a little farther off. He couldn't see any of the others now, but of course he'd been able to as soon as he got round the next bend. But when he rounded it, he couldn't see them. In fact, he could see nothing at all. His horse was walking now. "Get on, horse, get on," said Shasta. Then came the horn, very faint. Bree had always told him that he must keep his heels well turned out, and Shasta got the idea that something very terrible would happen if he dug his heels into the horse's side. This seemed to him an occasion for trying it. "Look here, horse," he said, "if you don't buck up, do you know what I'll do? I'll dig my heels into you. I really will." The horse, however, took no notice of this threat, so Shasta settled himself firmly in the saddle, gripped with his knees, clenched his teeth, and punched both the horse's sides with his heels as hard as he could. The only result was that the horse broke into a kind of pretence of a trot for 5 or 6 paces, and then it subsided into a walk again. And now it was quite dark, and they seemed to have given up blowing that horn. The only sound was the steady drip, drip from the branches of the trees. "Well, I suppose even a walk will get us somewhere sometime," said Shasta to himself. "I only hope I shan't run into Rabadash and his people." He went on for what seemed a long time, always at a walking pace. He began to hate that horse, and he was also beginning to feel very hungry. Presently he came to a place where the road divided into two. He was just wondering which led to Anvard when he was startled by a noise from behind. It was the noise of trotting horses. "Rabadash," thought Shasta. He had no way of guessing which road Rabadash would take. "But if I take one," said Shasta to himself, "he may take the other. If I stay at the crossroads, I'm sure to be caught." He dismounted and led the horse as quickly as he could along the right-hand road. The sound of the cavalry grew rapidly nearer, and in a minute or two Shasta realised that they were at the crossroads. He held his breath, waiting to see which way they would take. There came a low word of command. "Halt!" Then a moment of horsey noises, nostrils blowing, hooves pawing, bits being champed, necks being patted. Then a voice spoke. "Attend, all of you," it said. "We are now within a furlong of the castle. Remember your orders. Once we are in Narnia, as we should be by the sunrise, you are to kill as little as possible. On this venture you are to regard every drop of Narnian blood as more precious than a gallon of your own. On this venture, I say. The gods will send us a happier hour, and then You must leave nothing alive between Cair Paravel and the Western Waste. But we are not yet in Narnia. Here in Archenland it is another thing. In the assault of this castle of King Loon nothing matters but speed. Show your mettle. It must be mine within an hour, and if it is, I give it all to you. I reserve no booty for myself. Kill me every barbarian male within its walls, down to the child that was born yesterday, and everything else is yours to divide as you please. The women, the gold, the jewels, the weapons, and the wine. The man that I see hanging back when we come to the gates shall be burned alive. In the name of Tash, the irresistible, the inorexable, forward! With a great cloppety-clop, the column began to move, and Shasta began to breathe again. Then they had taken the other road. Shasta thought they took a long time going past, for though he had been talking and thinking about 200 horse all day, he had not realized how many they really were. But at last the sound died away, and once more he was alone amid the drip-drip from the trees. And now knew the way to Anvard, but of course he could not go there. What would mean running into the arms of Rabadash's troopers? What on earth am I to do? Said Shasta to himself, but he remounted the horse and continued along the road he had chosen in the faint hope of finding some cottage where he might ask for shelter and a meal. He had thought, of course, of going back to Aravis and Bree and Hwyn at the hermitage, but he couldn't because by now he had not the least idea of the direction. After all, said Shasta, this road is bound to get somewhere. But that all depends on what you mean by somewhere. The road kept on getting to somewhere in the sense that it got more and more trees, all dark and dripping, and colder air, and strange icy winds kept blowing the mist past him, though they never blew it away. If he had been used to the mountain country, he would have realized that this meant he was now very high up, perhaps right at the top of the pass, but Shasta knew nothing about mountains. I do think, said Shasta, that I must be the most unfortunate boy that ever lived in the whole world. Everything goes right for everyone except me. Those Narnian lords and ladies got safe away from Tashban. I was left behind. Aravis and Bree and Hwyn are all snug as anything with that old hermit. Of course I was the one who was sent on. King Loon and his people must have got safely into the castle and shut the gates long before Rabadash arrived. But I got left out. Being very tired and having nothing inside him, he felt so sorry for himself that tears rolled down his cheeks. What put a stop to all of this was a sudden fright. Shasta discovered that someone or somebody was walking beside him. It was pitch dark and he could see nothing, and the thing or person was going so quietly that he could hardly hear any footfalls. What he could hear was breathing. His invincible companion seemed to breathe on a very large scale, and Shasta got the impression that it was a very large creature. And he had come to notice this breathing so gradually that he had really no idea how long it had been there. It was a terrible shock. It darted into his mind that he'd heard long ago that there were giants in these northern country. He bit his lip in terror, but now that he had really had something to cry about, he stopped crying. The thing, unless it was a person, went on beside him, so very quietly that Shasta began to hope he had only imagined it. But just as he was beginning quite sure of it, there suddenly came a deep, rich sigh out of the darkness beside him. That couldn't be his imagination. Anyway, he had felt the hot breath of that sigh on his chilly left hand. If the horse had been any good, or if he had known how to get any good out of the horse, He would have risked everything on a breakaway and a wild gallop, but he knew he couldn't make that horse gallop. So he went on at a walking pace, and the unseen companion walked and breathed beside him. At last he could bear it no more. "Who are you?" he said, scarcely above a whisper. "One who has waited long for you to speak," said the thing. Its voice was not loud, but very large and deep. Are you a giant?" said Shasta. "You might call me a giant," said the large voice, "but I am not like the creatures you call giants." "I can't see you at all," said Shasta, after staring very hard. Then, for an even more terrible idea had come into his head, he said almost in a scream, You're not something dead, are you? Oh, please, please do go away. What harm have I done you? Oh, I'm the unluckiest person in the whole world." Once more he felt the warm breath of the thing on his hand and face. "There," it said, "that's not the breath of a ghost. Tell me your sorrows." Shasta was a little reassured by the breath, so he told how he had never known his real father or mother, and had been brought up sternly by the fishermen, and then he had told the story of his escape and how they were chased by lions and forced to swim for their lives, and of all their dangers in Tashbaan, and about his night among the tombs, and how the beasts howled at him in the desert. And he told how the heat and the thirst of their desert journey, and how they were almost at their goal when another lion chased them and wounded Aravis, and also how very long it was since he'd had anything to eat. "I do not call you unfortunate," said the large voice. "Don't you think it was bad luck to meet so many lions?" said Shasta. "There was only one lion," said the voice. "What on earth do you mean? I've just told you there were at least two the first night, and there was only one, but he was swift of foot." "How do you know?" "I was the lion." And Shasta gasped with open mouth and said nothing. The voice continued. "I was the lion who forced you to join with Aravis. I was the cat who comforted you among the houses of the dead. I was the lion who drove the jackals from you while you slept. I was the lion who gave the horses the new strength of fear for the last mile, so that you should reach King Loon in time. And I was the lion you do not remember who pushed the boat in which you lay, a child near death, so that it came to the shore where a man sat wakeful at midnight to receive you. Then it was you who wounded Aravis." "It was I." "But what for?" "Child," said the voice, "I am telling your story, not hers. I tell no one any story but his own." "Who are you?" asked Shasta. "Myself," said the voice, very deep and low, so that the earth shook, and again, "Myself," loud and clear and gay, and then a third time, "Myself," whispered, so softly you could hardly hear it, and yet it seemed to come from all around, as if the leaves rustled with it. Shasta was no longer afraid of the voice, of who it belonged to, or that it would eat him, nor that it was the voice of a ghost, but a new and different sort of trembling came over him. Yet he felt glad too. The mist was turning from black to grey, and from grey to white. This must have begun to happen some time ago, but while he had been talking to the thing, he had not been noticing anything else. Now the whiteness around him became a shining whiteness. His eyes began to blink. Somewhere ahead he could hear birds singing. He knew the night was over at last. He could see the mane and ears and the head of his horse quite easily now. A golden light fell on them from the left. He thought it was the sun. He turned and saw, pacing beside him, taller than the horse, a lion. The horse did not seem afraid of it, or else it couldn't see it. It was from the lion that the light came. No one ever saw anything more terrible or beautiful. Luckily, Shasta had lived all his life too far south in Calaman to have heard the tales that were whispered in Tashbaan about a dreadful Narnian demon that appeared in the form of a lion. And of course he knew none of the true stories about Aslan, the great lion, the son of the emperor over the sea, the king above all high kings in Narnia. But after one glance at the lion's face, he slipped out of the saddle and fell at its feet. He couldn't say anything, but then he didn't want to say anything, and he knew he didn't need to say anything. The high king above all kings stooped toward him. Its mane and some strange and solemn perfume that hung about his mane was all around him. It touched his forehead with its tongue. He lifted his face, and their eyes met. Then instantly the pale brightness of the mist and the fiery brightness of the lion rolled themselves together into a swirling glory that gathered themselves up and disappeared. He was alone with the horse on a grassy hillside under a blue sky, and there were birds singing. And that's the end of the chapter.